After 5 months of using the Sony FX30 as my primary camera for a lot of videography and live streaming work, I can confidently say that the FX30 is the best bang for your buck camera if you're needing a camera, a tool that not only makes you but also makes your clients money. From filming weddings to events to even content creation and in certain situations, higher end filmmaking, the FX30 has its place as a tool in every situation. Now, if you're new here, my name's Geoff Fagien. I'm primarily a cinematographer, DP, and also a freelance videographer content creator down here in South Florida. And I've been using the Canon and Sony cameras for the past few years, on and off. I've primarily been using Canon cameras as my main camera for the past 3 years has been the RED Komodo, which is an RF mount camera. So since I had a lot of RF mount lenses, accessories, and whatnot, it made a lot of sense to go the Canon route over Sony. But I've used Sony when I was working for Grant Cardone. We were using all FX3s over there. And also I've been using Sonys for various clients and production companies that own Sony equipment. So when the FX30 was announced, because of the features this camera had and also the fact that it was a Super 35 sensor, since a lot of my lenses are made for Super 35 APS-C sensors as well, the FX30 at that point made the most sense to jump into the Sony ecosystem and actually own one of their higher end cameras. I know it's not that expensive, it's under $2,000, but for the features that this camera offers, it's competing with their higher end FX3, A7S III. It may not perform as well in high ISOs, but when it comes to image quality, it's almost there. So when the FX30 was announced, it seemed like Sony's first crop sensor all-in-one camera. It really had most of the features from the FX3, A7S III, again, minus the low light capabilities. It doesn't really do well in high ISOs like those cameras do. It's also less than half the price of the FX3. It's not full frame. It actually is a higher megapixel sensor than the FX3, so when it comes to the actual video modes, you're getting downsampled 6K, which you're not getting on the FX3 and A7S III. So there are some differences as well that if you want a camera that gives you a downscaled image from a higher resolution, you're actually only going to get that from the FX30. You're not going to get that from the FX6, FX3, A7S III. Those cameras are all giving you a little bit higher than 4K, but not much higher. Their pixels on the full frame sensor are much bigger, which is why they perform a lot better in low light, especially compared to a camera like the FX30. So the FX30 has a sensor the size of Super 35. It is a 6K sensor around 26 megapixels, shoots up to 4K 60 in 10-bit using the entire sensor, again, downscaled from 6K, and then it does have a 4K 120 frames per second option, which is cropped in on the camera, unlike the higher-end FX3, A7S III, so there is a difference right there. Now, the FX30 is a video-first camera. It's even marketed as a cinema camera. So, although there are photo modes in this camera, they're very basic. You can really just take one still photo at a time. So, if you're buying this camera, you're most likely a video professional or using it for mostly video, and just buy it knowing that you're not really going to get many photography features with this specific camera. However, I think when we start getting cheaper, more affordable options in the crop sensor lineup from Sony, I think those will have a lot more hybrid options. They just won't have as many video options as the FX30. So coming from the RED Komodo is a little bit bigger than the sensor in the FX30. It's a 1.33 times crop of full frame, where the FX30 is a 1.5 times crop of full frame, but it still is absolutely Super 35. That's actually typically where the Super 35 sensors land. The RED Komodo just happens to be a little bit bigger than Super 35. Most of my lenses are Sigma Art lenses. I'm using the 18-35 a lot. I'm also using the 50-100 a lot for documentary, just because I love the image quality of that lens. It does breathe a lot, so for autofocusing, it's not the best lens when you're trying to rack your focus. You see a lot of that breathing. If you're shooting a subject that's still, it's for documentary purposes, the image quality is just fantastic, and it's meant for Super 35 APS-C. So with Sigma's MC11 adapter, both the 18-35 and the 50-100 work well on most of the Sony cameras. I just haven't really tested it on crop censored Sony cameras, as the FX30 is really the first crop censored camera that has all of these higher end 4K 10-bit frame rates. So in September of 2022, when this camera was announced, I took the plunge and I purchased the FX30, even though I was a little on edge because I knew that the Sigma lenses would most likely work with the MC11 adapter, but other than the Sigma lenses, I didn't really have any other glass that would work on the FX30. I had a lot of other Canon branded EF glass, but that glass doesn't work with the MC11 adapter the way that Sigma's art lenses work, which kind of makes sense. It's Sigma making for Sigma. Nonetheless, I took the plunge, didn't really know what to expect with the FX30, and it quickly became my go-to camera for all of my video work. Weddings, events, real estate, content creation, live streaming. It became my go-to for everything because it was just so easy to use this camera. And spoiler alert, for the most part, I was not using Sony lenses, even though I did buy some, test some, and do own some now. I was actually using the Sigma art lenses for pretty much all of my professional work because I found that the autofocus was not only really decent, but it was definitely good enough to use in actual video production. The autofocus just worked really well. Now, I did want to test out the Sony lenses, and instead of buying a bunch of Sony lenses, I tested out Sony's 15mm and their 11mm lens that were both made actually for crop-censored Sony cameras, so it felt like those would be the best to test. I did some videos on them. I'll put a link in the description below. Essentially, I tested out the 15mm and the 11mm. I kept the 11mm over the 15mm, not really because it was much cheaper, but because when it comes to the 11mm focal length, I didn't have any other lenses that would work well with the autofocus on the FX30, whereas the 15mm was close to my 18-35, and I did even want to get a little bit more telephoto than the 15mm offered, as light as that lens was, so I decided to just keep the 11mm over the 15mm. I also did a video discussing a little bit more into detail why. The one thing about using the Sony lenses with the FX30 is how light they are, especially compared to adapting lenses like the 18-35 onto the FX30. I mean, the weight of the FX30 with these super small and light prime lenses made by Sony was one of the reasons that I kept the FX30, because I was able to use it on super small gimbals like Zhiyun's Crane M2s, which is really meant more for extremely small cameras. We're talking like cameras the size of the ZV-1, and I was able to, without a cage, put the FX30, the 11mm, and the 15mm, plus a wireless audio receiver on top of the camera with my screen pointed outwards and facing me so I can actually see myself for the vlogs when I was filming myself. The whole situation just worked out amazing. I never thought I would be able to get that kind of image quality on such a super small and portable setup. So the FX30 at that point had me between its image quality and how light it was. It was just too light not to keep, especially compared to using my Canon R7, my R6. Those cameras are relatively light too, but I couldn't get the same setups on those cameras that I could with the FX30, which was huge and eye-opening for me. Now I think down the line, when Canon actually starts making some more professional crop-censored glass, then I think the whole weight thing is going to be very similar with cameras like the Canon R7, but at this current point in time, there really aren't any professional lenses that are specifically crop-censored super light lenses for Canon's RF ecosystem for crop-censored cameras. So right off the bat, I used the FX30, the 11mm, the 15mm, and the Zhiyun Crane M2s for a lot of real estate work. I used it for tons of content creation, and then from there, I used it on a few weddings, I used it for corporate work. It just worked really well in every situation, which was eye-opening for me because it now gave me a really decent camera I can use in Sony's ecosystem, and on a lot of these productions that I'm going on that I'm typically having to use their Sony cameras because I haven't had any Sony cameras that I can offer as a rental. Now I have the FX30 as a rental, which was kind of my plan in the beginning, but I didn't know how well it was going to work because no one really knew how well the FX30 was going to match to these other cameras. And yeah, I'm going to tell you right now, it doesn't completely match the other cameras. I did a quick test with the FX6 in a non-studio situation, really as rough as possible to see how close we could get them, and it showed that the cameras don't match exactly. If you're filming in S-Log3, then that is going to be the best way you can match the FX30 across Sony's ecosystem, whether it's an FX9, FX6, FX3, A7S3. You can get them to match. It is just going to take a little bit more work. It's not just about S-Log3. I think it's also about having an E-mount, using the same battery as some of the Sony cameras. There's a lot of things that it shares with other Sony cameras that also make it a clear no-brainer to get if you're filming in a Sony ecosystem. Now, when it comes to live streaming, the FX30 instantly replaced the R6 and the R7 for me. The biggest reason was I was able to get video and audio out of the USB-C port while charging the camera. I was able to just plug the USB-C into the FX30, and not only does it work off the bat without having to even use the HDMI, but I also charge the camera at the same time, so I don't have to worry about the camera dying. On the R7 and the R6, I was essentially always streaming out of the HDMI port, which, if you need to stream in 4K, I actually do recommend using the HDMI out on the FX30, because although the technical specifications list that you can stream in 4K out of the USB-C port, it's limited to 15 frames per second, and that's, at least in my opinion, not really usable for live streaming in 4K. So just note that if you need to stream in 4K. For the most part, if you're live streaming to Facebook, YouTube, whatever, most of these platforms are only taking a 720p signal. YouTube will take a 1080p signal, but they're not taking 4K. So I think if you need 4K, you probably know what to do. The FX30 does have a fan in the camera, and I believe that's one of the reasons why it can offer all of these modes and have absolutely no overheating. I've used this camera all day, multiple times, never had an issue overheating. Another really great feature is the fact that the FX30 can actually use SD cards. If you have V90 SD cards, almost all of the frame rates can be used on the V90 SD cards, and it saves you a buttload of money without having to go through the CF Express. Now, I did buy a CF Express because for the one frame rate you can't use, it is the highest bitrate version of the 4K 120. If you need to shoot in the highest bitrate 4K 120, then you need the CF Express card, and that's part of the reason why I bought it. But you can film in 4K 120 in the lower bitrate options, which are totally usable on a V90 SD card. I did see a video where someone said the true cost of the FX30 is much higher than you're led to believe, and yeah, that's true only if you're buying CF Express cards, and I believe that 90% of the people buying the FX30 can get away with V90 SD cards. Heck, you can even use the highest bitrate 24p options on V90 SD cards versus using the CF Express card. So I think a lot of people are just not experimenting with V90 because they think, oh, well, if it has CF Express, why wouldn't I use CF Express? It's meant to be used with CF Express. And yes, for certain frame rates, literally 4K 120, it's meant for that. I recommend using V90 SD cards. For literally all of my gigs, I'm using V90 SD cards. And it also helps because I have multiple V90 SD cards instead of one 80 gigabyte CF Express card. Now, like I said, I do have that as a backup. I also have it occasionally for when I need to shoot the 4K high bitrate 120p mode. I've never actually been asked to shoot the high bitrate 120p mode. It's been really more for me just to see the difference. And for most situations, you'd be able to get away with the more compressed ones that will work on a V90 SD card. You can get some of these V90 SD cards, 64 gig, 128 for under $100. Now, when it comes to the preamps of the FX30, they're pretty decent. They're pretty much as good as all the other DSLR mirrorless cameras in this category, pretty much as good as the FX3. I'm using the microphone jack right now. I haven't really tested the FX30 with the XLR handle that goes directly to the top of the camera. I have used that on the FX3. It's nice if you're using XLR audio microphones. However, I'm not using mostly XLR audio microphones. I'm just using the 3.5mm microphone jack, and I've got great results. But it is worth noting, I think if you're using XLR, if you're not going to get the XLR top handle, you're going to have to buy some kind of preamp anyways. So if you're going XLR, I do recommend getting the XLR audio handle. When it comes to battery life of the FX30, it's using the same battery that's in the A7S III, the FX3, and it's pretty decent. I get around an hour worth of battery life out of this battery, which again isn't a lot. A big benefit to this camera is the fact that it can charge over power delivery via its USB-C port. So when I've been shooting with this camera on the gimbal, which I can't really get power from the gimbal itself, I, for right now, have been using the internal battery. I have two batteries from Sony. Between turning the camera off and on, and also charging the battery when I need to, which over power delivery, it charges extremely fast, I've been able to get away with two batteries doing that method for an entire wedding shooting 11 hours. Now, for a lot of my longer gigs where I'm basically letting the FX30 live on a tripod, I've actually just got a really long power delivery USB-C cord that I hook in from the camera to a V-mount that's just sitting on the floor, and that's also lasted me the whole day as well, so I haven't had to purchase a bunch of batteries for this camera. Now let's talk about IBIS. When it comes to using the IBIS on this camera, I've really used it mostly to film B-roll on a lot of my corporate and documentary gigs, and the IBIS is decent. Now, when it comes to filming yourself, let's take a look on how it works when it comes to vlogging. So when it comes to using the Sony FX30 as a vlog camera, I think it actually works spectacularly as a vlog camera. I've been using it with the Zhiyun Crane M2s for a few months, pretty much since September up until the gimbal broke, and it's been working fantastic. Today I'm using it handheld with the Sony 11mm with a little Joby GorillaPod action, and it seems to be working pretty well. The main difference is I actually have active stabilization on here, whereas when I have it on the gimbal, I don't have active stabilization on, which means I get to use the full sensor instead of cropping in on the sensor. I do think the FX30 is a little overkill for vlogging, but at this time, Sony doesn't have any crop censored 10-bit options. However, I think the FX30 is the start of what we'll start getting, which is crop censored 10-bit Sony cameras that are probably limited to 4K 30. So where I think Sony got the FX30 right, it's gonna come to number one, the features that this camera offers. Number two, the weight. It is a lighter camera than the FX3. It also is relatively light compared to a lot of its competition if you're also using Sony's extremely light prime lenses. And then, of course, the price. The price is really good. It's around $1,800. It's blowing away a lot of its competition. I actually think the FX30, for a lot of people, especially if you're doing videography work, is a much better camera option than using something like a Blackmagic Pocket 6K. I love that camera. I had it for a long time, but there are some things lacking, especially autofocus for a lot of these wedding event type gigs where autofocus is literally a deal breaker for those. It saves you so much time shooting a wedding event, whatever, live stream, for instance, where if your subject's going in and out, it just tracks them so seamlessly, you wouldn't even know the autofocus is working the entire time. Whereas on the Blackmagic cameras, there's obviously no autofocus, so there's a little give and take on those cameras. For me, using the Sony FX30 over my Canon cameras, even my RED Komodo for certain gigs, it all came down to usability, and Sony made the FX30 an extremely easy to use camera. I mean, probably wasn't that hard because they just took a lot of the really great things from the FX3, and here it is on the FX30. So at this point here in 2023, for pretty much all of my videography-based gigs, whether it's real estate, weddings, events, live streaming, I'm using the FX30 for all of those. When it comes to my higher end gigs, I'm still using my RED Komodo. And actually, other than this video right here, when it comes to a lot of my content creation, a lot of my YouTube work, I am still using the R7 for that because I'm filming pretty much all of it in 24p, and it allows me to leave that camera in the studio and bring the FX30 as my camera for a lot of my gigs. I don't have to pack it every time. It's always good to go. So I hope by watching this video, you could see why the Sony FX30 after 5 months works for me as my primary camera when it comes to all of my videography work. And it's funny because I joked around with my buddy Josh Satin about when I first got the FX30, I thought I was going to return it because at first I just didn't see its value, but then when I started actually using it for gigs, even though it doesn't have the same image quality as my RED Komodo or some of the higher end cameras that are out there, like the C70, FX3, whatever, it works really well for my uses. And sometimes it's not always about having the most premium image quality, but having the features as a tool that help you get your job done. So if you have any questions about the FX30, anything you want to see on that camera, future reviews, make sure to ask in the comments below. And if you got knowledge and value out of today's video, please make sure to hit that like, subscribe, and notification bell to keep up to date with the latest videos from the channel. Until next time, my name's Geoff Fagien. Thank you for watching as always, everybody, and I will see you in the next video.